Hello, in this video, we're going to be talking about what I believe is probably the most important aspect of all of brain health, whether it's treatment, prevention, whether it's Alzheimer's disease, whether it's understanding, whether you are seeking to optimize your brain or just seeking to prevent a condition or just seeking to understand how the brain works. This is the core and it's all about brain energy. So we're going to get into it, and I'm going to show you how and why I say what I say. What I why I I'm going to tell you about why I think this is so important, and it all starts with our work back in Nigeria, with the Brain and Body Foundation, treating kids. You probably heard my story 1,000 times. So we started treating kids with severe brain disorders, and we got very very successful at it because we were using nutrients that the brain needed. So for a lot of for most most for the most part, treatment of brain disorders has been about using physical therapy or using drugs to control symptoms. Very little was said and done, at least seriously said and done, about using using nutrients as a tool, as a weapon, and really leaning into it and really focusing on it, and not just as an addendum, so to speak. So we started using nutrients exclusively, and we saw a lot of great results. However, when we started treating adults with neurodegenerative conditions like dementia, strokes, Parkinson's disease, our success rates dropped tremendously. I mean, it was ridiculous. We just couldn't seem to get ourselves out of a box or find our way out of a box. And it wasn't until we actually learned about energy, brain energy, and learning how to increase and optimize brain energy that we started seeing results. And so that's why I had this picture here that I'm supposed to have seen. Um, all right, so the brain needs a lot of energy. Remember this whole I've shown this slide 1,000 times. I used to say this is not when the world is going to end, and so you can see how dated that is. I've got to come up with a new joke for that. But I used to say that was when the world was going to end way back in the 2020s, 2021s. Anyway, so I found the slide I was looking for. This basically is how we started learning, how we discovered um, how important energy was to the treatment of the brain. And that's why it's the green one at the very top. We got to start with that, no matter what else we're doing, whether it's addressing blood flow, addressing the support of the rest of the nervous system, or whether it's hormonal support, which is extremely important, especially in women, gut support, detoxification. It all had to start with energy. It had to start with energy. It had to end with energy. Because if you think about it, without if you think about it, without addressing the brain's energy needs, it can't repair itself. It can't recover. You can't even sleep properly if the brain has inadequate energy, because it needs energy to sleep, believe it or not. Sleep is not just a passive process, it's a very active process. So energy is the be all end all when it comes to brain health. Anyway, I had our good friend ChatGPT kind of draw out a slide, just kind of like rank the areas of the brain that needed the most energy. And of course, as you can imagine, the cerebral cortex, the part of the thinking brain or the moving brain, but most especially the prefrontal cortex, which is right here above your eyes. Yeah, just above the eyes, or behind the eyes, I would say. That's the part that has to do with executive function. Is probably the part that makes us most human after the speaking center. That's where you plan, you execute, you judge, you weigh options, and so on. So obviously it's going to require a lot of interconnections between brain cells and brain regions, and therefore it's going to require a lot of energy. That's why it's at the top. Next is the hippocampus, which has to do with memory. So obviously that's going to be important as well. Most people seem to understand memory, or seem to they point at memory as a thing that is missing or that is affected in dementia. That's not entirely true. There are types of dementia in which memory is intact. But there's the problem with judgment and decision making and long-term planning and calculating stuff. So, like I said, the cerebral cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex, is very important. And the other parts of the brain we're not going to get into, you can look at the slides. Like I said, energy is needed for function, for structure, and for protection. Everything falls under those three. The most need for energy is in that connection. It is in just passing messages or passing signals between one brain cell and the next. Remember, there are over 100 trillion different connections in the brain. So that takes, so you can understand why it takes such a huge chunk of the brain's energy supply. That's about 80%. That's huge. We were not taught this in medical school, I can promise you that. So then the other few things are housekeeping and the support of the support of the support cells. So the glial cells need help as well. And that's where, like I said, this is where it all happens. This is where it all happens between the brain cells and the network. So if the network, so think about this, if the network is not getting enough energy to maintain itself, then you can understand why things begin to falter. There's a term called network instability, because what happens is, I mean, you probably, okay, I can relate to this being from a third world country, but there are times when there's a surge, or in some areas, the generator, for instance, when we're trying to generate energy and some parts are maybe they're draining the energy. Like for instance, somebody decides to put on an iron, pressing iron, and all of a sudden you just see a dip in electricity. The lights go dim, the fans go off, or we turn on the freezer, for instance. I mean, we can definitely relate to this. So we would have to, I mean, there were some things that you just know you didn't turn on, otherwise you would get in serious trouble, especially if the generator was on. It's something similar to that. If there's something that drain power, and so you have to turn those things off. And so what the brain does is that in order to conserve power, if it's not getting enough, if it doesn't have enough energy to meet all its different functions, to meet all its different needs, it begins to prioritize. And so it kind of like rations things out. So if, for instance, and I'm going to show you a few examples of what happens when brain energy is low. But one of the top things is that inability to pay attention, because attention takes a lot of energy. It's not a passive thing. There are many things that we think are passive that are actually, the brain is working super hard to perform, just so you can perform those activities. One of them is even listening. But one of the first things that we begin to see is a reduction in the ability to pay attention or to concentrate over a period of time. And then, of course, many of you've probably seen one or two, or even all of these different examples: glitches, some people talk about brain farts, senior moments, wires crossing, making the wrong connections. All of these are symptoms of low energy production in the brain. Another one is asking the same question over and over and over again. And we're going to explain in another video why we lose our brain energies drop. Obviously, one reason is aging, but there are other conditions too that cause a drop in brain energy. Following a conversation, especially in a group setting, when there's noise, everybody's talking. That's one of the keys. There is one psychiatrist lady who developed early onset dementia, and her first symptom that she noticed was that she would go out for dinner with a group of friends, and she would have difficulty following the conversation. It was just too much, and she thought maybe she had problems. She was losing her hearing. Went to the audiologist, had it checked. Boom, perfect hearing. Someone suggested maybe it's dementia. Of course, she was like, impossible. Anyway, she went ahead, long story short, and yeah, sure enough, it was dementia. Now, good for her. she decided not to just take that diagnosis lying down. And so she went to start looking into it and digging and digging and digging, found out that there were indeed other specialists who are treating dementia successfully. She learned how to do it for herself. She learned what her brain needed and started providing that. And she turned it around. And now she is treating people with dementia. She's shifted, and she's a big time researcher in that field as well. So that's one story that tells you that you can reverse dementia. Okay, so this is another slide showing the parts of the brain that are first affected in Alzheimer's disease. Also, the parts when there are two traits that are common to these places, to these regions. The parts that have to do with the highest density synapses, and number two, the parts that require the most energy. Basically, they're one and the same, in my opinion. So how does the brain meet its energy requirements? We're going to look at that in the next slide, next video, excuse me. But I just want to impress upon you the need for energy. Energy is the be all end all. And if we can get it right, I mean, my personal conviction is that if we can figure out the problem of energy, then for the most part, you can figure out dementia. And I'm not saying that that's all there is to it. Obviously, in dementia, there's damage to the structure of the brain. There are cells that are being poisoned. There are cells that are dying. But if you can solve the energy problem, if you can solve it, it's going to go a long way towards recovery. In my opinion, you probably will not have Alzheimer's disease if you can ensure that your brain has optimal levels of energy. And I'm not saying the brain is going to be working at 100%. I'm not saying that your brain will be working perfectly well. But if you solve that energy problem and you ensure that your brain is getting enough energy, it's going to go a long way. I mean, it probably would not be that Alzheimer's disease would no longer be the diagnosis. I'm pretty sure of that. So that's it for now, and then we'll see you in the next video.